So as Daniel said, I am not an astronomer, and the closest that I ever got to being an astrophysicist was when my Year 9 physics teacher wrote one sentence on my school report, and it was, "not a natural physicist." But I am good at literature and science fiction in particular, and I'm interested in astronomy and astrophysics in fiction and what happens to astronomy and astrophysics when it gets turned into fiction. So what I'm talking about is a little bit ad hoc, because up until a few days ago I was doing a completely different talk, until I had a conversation with someone sitting over there and realised it was the wrong talk. Because I had this great talk on science fiction in science communication and how it's this great tool for science and popularising science, and I had studies which talk about how people who read science fiction are better scientifically educated and more open-minded to scientific process and progress. And then I noticed some problems. And the first problem is that that's not necessarily true. For all the studies I found about the great role of science fiction in scientific communication, I also found a whole load of studies showing that science fiction can proliferate miscommunication in science and promote pseudoscience and promotes fear of scientific progress. But there was a bigger problem, even than that. And that was that that's not what I do. I'm not interested in science fiction as science communication. I have nothing to do with science communication. So I scrapped it and just thought, I'll just tell them what I do. So that's what I'm doing. So, I'm interested in astronomy, astrophysics, in science fiction, and what happens to it when it gets changed into fiction, because it always gets changed. Science appears in science fiction, but it's always changed into something else. And that's because science fiction doesn't have the same job as science or science communication. It's doing something else. Which is also why it can be really hard to have productive conversations about how science fiction and science come together. Because when people are talking about astronomy in science fiction, they're not necessarily talking about the same astronomy. They're not talking about the same thing. So it doesn't always work. Enter me with the explanations of how it works. And there is a contact point, and the contact point is telling stories, because that's what science is. All of science is telling stories. It's telling stories about the world that we're in, the universe that we're in. It's telling stories about how we do science. And this is contrary to a mathematician who came up to me after a talk at a conference and said, "We are mathematicians, we do not have stories, we only have numbers." But I'm here to prove it wrong. So, some of you can see these and they can read the story in these. Some of you can see these and you can see the behavioural properties of the planets in the TRAPPIST-1 systems. You look at it and it tells you a story about what that system looks like, how it behaves. Some of you can look at these equations and you can tell the story of these equations. You can look at this and you can tell the story of the activities of those people investigating the TRAPPIST system. In your face, mathematician with only numbers. You would be able to tell a story if I hadn't just randomly cut and pasted equations from an article with no understanding of what they're actually saying, which I'm guessing is a bit like cutting out sentences from a novel and then saying, "Look guys, it tells a story." But you get like the big picture of what I'm And you can humour me and you can say, yes, Zoe, this tells a story, a lovely narrative of investigating the TRAPPIST system. So then we get to this. We get to the communication part. And these NASA pictures, they tell the story of the TRAPPIST system as well in a different way. We can see which of the planets are in the Goldilocks zone because they look like Earth. But to make the system more understandable, to make it more imaginable, this is moving further away from actual direct representation. It's moving further away from the data. So these pictures, they're not lies, and they're not necessarily wrong, but they're fictions. These are fictional images. And this is also where the whys then start to come in. Why are we, for instance, so drawn to this idea of habitable planets as actually being habitable? Everyone knows we're not going to go here. So why do we have this impulse to go so quickly from Earth-like planet to full-on pioneer spirit and getting there? Why do we turn particular scientific discoveries into particular types of stories? And that's what all of these are doing. They're all doing it to various degrees and to various levels of success, but they're on there because they've got cool covers. So. And in these, space research isn't any longer about what we might find, but about what it would mean if we found it. Because science fiction is all about what if, all of it. What if we can live somewhere other than our own planet? What if we do find evidence of exobiology? And it's that moment that I'm interested in. It's that moment when somebody takes scientific theory or scientific discovery and goes, yeah, but what if that meant, and then they carry that through into whatever science fiction plot that's going to be for them. And this is why I need astronomers and astrophysicists. Because in science fiction studies, and that is an actual thing that people have on their email signatures, I don't want to say now. There are politics in literature as well as in the hard sciences. So science fiction studies makes a distinction between hard science fiction and fantasy. And everyone recognises that it's really important to make that distinction, but hardly anybody agrees on what that distinction actually is and how to make it. And this is especially because the distinction isn't just how far removed is this particular novel from the science that it's claiming to represent. They're all far removed from the science that they're claiming to represent, because that's what makes them science fiction in the first place. But they all have different relationships with the science. Star Wars, for instance, has lots to tell us about tyranny and society and the individual, but it's fantasy. It takes place in an alternate universe in all important respects. And if we have something like Andy Weir's The Martian, that's also science fiction, but it's having a different type of conversation with the science that it draws on. Let's go past it. And okay, where was I? Oh, I was on Mars with Andy Weir, wasn't I? Okay. So Andy Weir's novel is not asking what if the universe was different and controlled by a Death Star. Andy Weir's universe is asking, what if we could do this particular thing in our own universe? What would it mean for us to be able to do that? How many potatoes would it take for us to be able to do that? And Mars is actually quite a nice example. Because these are just a few, and I mean a tiny few, of the science fiction novels which are interested in near future exploration and colonization of Mars. They engage with the logistics and the scientific plausibility of getting to Mars to varying degrees, which I'll tell you about in a second, but they all engage with imagining going to Mars. The Martian's there again, and we're Martian is there again, and that it's been described as a love letter to science. It takes the science of going to Mars as we know it and as we can describe it currently, and it just takes it and turns it and changes it a little bit until it becomes a human narrative and something we recognise as a human narrative. What if we're faced with the pioneer frontier again? What would a 21st century pioneer spirit look like? And how many potatoes do I need to calculate before Zoe takes the book and throws it against the wall in absolute distress? There are so many potatoes in the book, you really got no idea. So many potatoes. Anyway. Just to the left of that, you can see Red Star, which, as the title might have suggested, is not that dedicated to scientific authenticity. Red Star is dedicated to Bolshevism, and it's a 1908 not Russian novel about a communist utopia on Mars. Yeah, it's cool. You should read it. It's cool in its own way. But they're sort of working on different scales in terms of their relationship with the science in which they're claiming to be drawn. But they're all interested in what ifs in different ways. They're interested in the politics of it, about our sense of identity, about how badly are we going to fuck up this particular planet before we seriously have to consider moving on and fucking up another one. And it's true though. And so, because of that, perhaps science fiction in a roundabout way, and I'm sounding dodgily like a science communicator, I think, but in a roundabout way it has something to contribute. Because the kinds of actual real-life scientific exploration that takes place is often just as much about desirability as it is about feasibility. And my sort of task is to look at what kinds of stories are being told and what are the consequences that these stories are having on our relationship with space and on our relationship with space exploration in all the forms that it's taken. My own what if is, what if we change scientific activity into stories? Because these are the stories that we talk about when we think about what discoveries mean for us as humans. Something like habitability comes to represent not just the distance of a planet from its sun, but that we're making our own planet uninhabitable. And to be part of that story, the science becomes something slightly different. And this might be a good thing, and sometimes it might be a bad thing. But it's always worth looking at what's happening when it's getting changed into these stories. Because this is what happens when nobody is paying careful attention to the stories of science. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong, because I'm very aware that Space Force is about as born of science fiction as it's possible to get in terms of imagining space. Yeah. But this is why science fiction is awesome, because whatever direction science heads in and whatever direction non-scientists think heading, science fiction somewhere has always looked ahead into that direction and said, yeah, but what if we actually did that? What if we follow through on that? And they've thought about all of the sort of end points of that, what it might mean for that, for us to do that. And some of them are implausible, and some of them stretch the line from science so far that it snaps, essentially. But this, and this we're going to find out if it works or not, this is what happens when nobody is thinking carefully about the stories.
What is Space Force?
You know, space exploration and just finding out what's out there, I guess.
But NASA does space exploration.
NASA is only going to tell us what they want us to know.
NASA lies. That, my friends, is the sound of a narrative vacuum. That's what that is. And so, sometimes science fiction might be more science, and sometimes science fiction might be more fiction. It's always awesome.